In Chinese perception, opium and the Opium War brought the great Chinese empire to its knees. Now, this view of the Opium War is now one of the founding episodes of modern Chinese nationalism. If you look at a lot of the British sources on the war, you'll find that they're full of racial prejudice and self-justification.
Right.
If you look at the Chinese accounts of the war, they've long been very, very emotional.
南石林是新一代汉学家中的代表人物，在他最近的一本书中，他试图从英国人的视角来理解鸦片战争的发生与缘起。此外，他也是张爱玲与鲁迅的翻译者。
How did you evolve into China and interest in China history?
Before I came to Nanjing in 1997, I'd already studied Chinese for 2 years at the University of Cambridge. They have a wonderful department of Chinese studies there. So I had learnt contemporary Chinese, modern Chinese, Baihua. I also learnt classical Chinese, Wenyan, and I'd also been given a broad education in Chinese history. So roughly from Shangzhou, those two dynasties, all the way through to 改革开放. Then after I graduated from Cambridge, because I'd already studied world history, 世界历史, for 2 years at Cambridge before I studied Chinese, I knew that I wanted to pursue a career in Chinese studies, but I needed to improve my Chinese language skills and my ability to read sources. So I discovered there is this wonderful centre in Nanjing called the 中美中心, which is a collaborative venture between the Johns Hopkins University and Nanjing 大学.
So what's the tradition for the Cambridge China study for you?
Extremely rigorous. Very, very rigorous. A heavy emphasis on a very well-rounded education, that you're not just going to study one aspect of Chinese literature or language or history. There's the sense that you really need to understand it in the round. So for me, the great thing that I learnt from my Chinese studies education in Cambridge is to keep a very, very open mind, to really try to take advantage of every opportunity to study.
When we're back to the Opium War, which part is the most difficult for you to finish the book?
I think, though, that probably the greatest challenge was a methodological challenge, an intellectual challenge, because the two views of the war, the British views and the Chinese views, the reports on the war, the opinions on the war, were so different. How to synthesize these two conflicting views, how to bring them together within one account, that was a great challenge. And sometimes the challenges were so great that I just couldn't resolve them. And the solution which I undertook in that instance was to present the primary sources to the reader. Say, look, this side says this side said that, you decide. 总之而言，那个 in summary， 对我来讲，一个比较大的情形，就是19世纪中国那种复杂性。
那你对林则徐的印象是怎么样的？
Obviously, an extremely moral and extremely upright individual, and that was a relatively rare thing at the time, because obviously it was a big problem with corruption in the Qing government at that time. But I think I would probably agree with Mao Haijian's 马海健对他的评价就是林则徐做过很多好事情，但是他也不是神，什么人都不是神。So he did have his limitations, obviously, and he had to reflect some of the preconceptions, some of the ideas of the era.
Who is the most interesting figure in the book for you?
I'm interested in internal contradictions, and from that perspective, Eliot struck me as very, very interesting. Obviously in China, for reasons that I can completely understand, he is seen as a great villain. A very bad person who helped start the Opium War. He's almost the architect of this extremely traumatic war. However, the curious thing is that he hated the opium trade himself. This is a very extraordinary thing. It's a very tragic thing. I see him almost as a tragic figure in some ways. Obviously, he did things which brought tragedy to other people, and I don't excuse those at all. But in some ways, he is also tragic, and at the same time, as I discuss in my book, the British government hated him as well, because they thought that he was too soft on the Chinese government, that he compromised with them, whereas of course the Chinese side also disliked him. So he was someone, he was absolutely caught in the middle. And some of the things which he tried to do in the negotiations were actually okay. He was trying not to ask for too much money from the Chinese. He didn't want to humiliate them. He wanted to maintain pragmatism between the two sides. He thought this was possible, but the British government thought otherwise. So from that whole situation struck me as very strange, interesting, and of course sad.
如果没有发生鸦片战争，中国的历史会是19世纪历史会是怎么样的
To my mind, one of the major legacies of the Opium War, and this is something I wanted to trace out in the book, it's not just what happened in the Opium War, it's also how the memory of the Opium War has influenced Chinese history since then, and also China's interactions with the outside world and the West. Because, of course, within China, the Opium War is seen as the first emblematic war with the West, which dragged China violently and traumatically into a modern Western-dominated world. And in many respects, we, and particularly someone like me as a Western person and Western governments, are still dealing with the fallout, with the consequences of this first traumatic collision. A lot of the suspicion, misunderstandings, which transpire between China and Western governments have their roots in the tragedy of the First Opium War. The fighting of the First Opium War created in China an impression towards the West that the Western countries, including Britain, of course, are plotting to undermine China, to contain China, to destroy China with gunboats, with guns, and with opium. If China had not, if China's entry into this modern international Western-dominated world had not been under such traumatic conditions, then I think that very likely China's relations with the world up to today would be different.
Was the war inevitable or evitable for you?
It was inevitable from the perspective of British economic calculations, because if you look at the history of the British Empire in the 19th century, it quickly becomes very clear that the revenues that the British government obtained from the opium trade made a massive contribution to the running, to the development, to the expansion of the British Empire. And that's the case, all the way through to the 1930s, from the mid-19th century, through to the early 20th century. The opium revenues are paying for a large part of the costs of colonial governments in Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, and so on and so forth. But also the revenues which were obtained, which were returned to England via the opium trade, had a direct impact on the increase of British military power in this era, because the way that the trade worked was that the British sold opium grown in India to China. British merchants there used that silver to buy tea. That tea was shipped back to the British market, but before it was sold off to private traders, the British government would take its customs dues, would exact a customs tax, and a large part of that customs money was used to pay for the British Navy. So obviously without the British Navy there is no British Empire. So some historians would even say that it's no coincidence that the major expansion of the British Empire corresponds directly to the major expansion of the opium trade. And then 反过来, after 1900, the decline of the British Empire corresponds directly to the decline of the opium trade. So this is a very shameful, a very embarrassing fact. It's a fact which is insufficiently understood and discussed in British society today. When it was published in Britain, I was quite surprised actually at how little was known about the Opium War. In terms of our memory of the British Empire, we paid more attention to what Britain was doing in India or in the Middle East or in Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I think if I'd been more aware of this as I was writing, I think I would have been more careful to try to draw historical lessons about the importance of the opium trade to the British Empire. I would have emphasised emphasised more heavily the great sense of national shame that it should bring. I would have liked to have discussed more carefully why it is that we don't know more about this opium trade.
So you mentioned the shame, and in China we also have kind of shame, national shame. Could you compare the two shames?
I think that I probably use a slightly different term for translating the Chinese sense of shame. In English we tend to say sense of national humiliation. 国耻,百年国耻. I think in China, for understandable reasons, there is a strong sense that China was a victim within the course of modern Chinese of modern history, whereas in Britain there's a sense of feeling shame at what we did to other countries, because in Britain today very few people would feel pride at the British Empire. I think some people don't think about it from that perspective. We're very post-imperial, but we think of the British Empire as heavily tarnished by racism, by the exploitation of other countries' wealth. If you want to look for the causes of poverty in continents like Africa today, obviously colonialism has such a role to play in that. So from the British perspective, it's a sense of shame at what was done to other countries, whereas in China, of course, it's a more internally directed emotion.
So you moved between literature and history. So what's the connection between the two areas, and what's the difference?
I think that for someone working in any area, they can do that, and they're certainly complementary. Better understanding of the history leads to better understanding of the literature, and vice versa. So, for example, for this book, I used some literary sources from a collection called 鸦片战争文学集. So I did use poems and novels and essays and so on and so forth. But I think there's a particular logic behind a particularly good reason for being interdisciplinary, for moving between history and literature in the context of 20th century China, because politics, because history had such a deep impact on literary and on cultural developments. It's a logical thing to do, to consider the two things side by side, so they are not conflicting at all, but they feed into each other.